The streetlight flickered above as Priya sat on the concrete steps outside her home, textbook balanced on her knees. It was past 9 in the evening, and the narrow lane was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic from the main road. She squinted at the diagrams in her science book, trying to make sense of the chapter on electric circuits. Inside their single room, there was barely enough space for 2 people to move around, let alone study comfortably. Her father, Rajesh, had already left for his night shift at the corporate building downtown. He worked as a watchman there, standing guard from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and that mattered more than anything else. Before leaving, he had placed a small plate of rice and dal next to Priya, insisting she eat before studying. She had promised him she would, though the food sat untouched beside her books. Priya was 12 years old, thin as a reed, with oil-smoothed hair tied back in a tight braid. Her school uniform, washed so many times the blue had faded to gray, was neatly pressed. She took pride in that. No matter how little they had, her father always said they should carry themselves with dignity. And Priya did. She walked to school every morning with her head held high, even when other children whispered about her worn shoes or the fact that she never had money for the canteen. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about batteries and bulbs and how electricity flowed through wires. It fascinated her, this invisible force that could light up a room or power a fan. Last week, their neighbor's radio had stopped working, and Priya had asked if she could look at it. The neighbor had laughed, saying what could a child possibly do, but had handed it over anyway. Priya had opened the back panel, studied the mess of wires and components inside, and after an hour of careful work, had gotten it running again. The neighbor had been amazed. Word spread in their small community. Soon people started bringing her broken things. A torch that wouldn't light, a doorbell that had gone silent, a toy car that no longer moved. Priya fixed them all, learning something new with each repair. She never asked for money, though sometimes people insisted on giving her a few coins or some fruit. Her father was proud but worried. He didn't want her to become known as the girl who fixed things. He wanted more for her. He wanted her to study, to go to college, to become someone important. Rajesh himself had never been to school. His father had been a farmer, and Rajesh had worked in the fields since he was old enough to hold a sickle. When drought had destroyed their crops year after year, the family had moved to the city. Rajesh had done whatever work he could find. Construction labor, pulling rickshaws, washing dishes at roadside restaurants. Then finally the watchman job. It was the best work he'd had in years. There was a uniform, a fixed salary, and most importantly, it gave him time during the day to make sure Priya went to school. Priya's mother had died when she was only 5. Fever had taken her within 3 days before they could scrape together enough money for the hospital. Rajesh had never remarried. He couldn't imagine bringing another woman into their tiny room, and more than that, he wanted to focus everything on Priya. She was all he had left of his wife. The same sharp eyes, the same quick smile, the same stubborn determination. When Priya had been admitted to the government school 3 kilometers away, Rajesh had actually cried. The school had a reputation. It was strict, but it was good. Children from that school went on to do well in life. Some even went to college. The admission test had been difficult, and there had been only 30 seats for over 200 children. But Priya had scored the highest marks. The headmaster had personally called Rajesh to congratulate him. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Priya had thrown herself into her studies with an intensity that both pleased and worried her father. She woke up at 5 every morning, studied for an hour before getting ready for school, walked the long distance there and back, and then studied late into the night. She rarely played. She had no time for friends. When Rajesh suggested she take a break, go to the park, be a child for once, she would shake her head. There was too much to learn, she said. Too much to catch up on, because Priya knew she was behind. The other children in her class came from families where parents could afford tutors and extra books. They had comfortable homes with study tables and proper lighting. They brought fancy lunch boxes and wore new uniforms. Priya had none of that, but she had something else. She had a hunger to learn that none of them possessed. She had a mind that could grasp complex ideas quickly, and she had a father who believed in her completely. One evening, about a month into the new school year, Priya's science teacher, Mrs. Mehta, had asked her to stay back after class. Priya's heart had sunk. Had she done something wrong? But Mrs. Mehta had smiled and asked her where she had learned to think like a scientist. Priya had been confused. She didn't think like a scientist. She just tried to understand how things worked. Mrs. Mehta had shown her the assignment they'd submitted that week. The question had been to explain how a light bulb works. Most students had copied the answer from the textbook, but Priya had drawn detailed diagrams and written about the flow of electrons and the heating of the filament in a way that showed deep understanding. More than that, she had written about what happens when a bulb fails and how to test if the filament was broken. Practical knowledge that only came from hands-on experience. From that day, Mrs. Mehta had taken special interest in Priya. She lent her books from her personal collection. She stayed late to explain difficult concepts. She saw in Priya what Rajesh saw, a brilliant mind trapped in circumstances that could either crush it or forge it into something extraordinary. Tonight, sitting under the streetlight, Priya finally understood the circuit diagram she'd been studying. She smiled to herself, closed the book, and picked up her plate of cold food. Tomorrow, Mrs. Mehta was going to announce something important about a science competition. Priya didn't know the details yet, but she felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. Something was about to change. She could feel it in the air, like the charge that builds before lightning strikes. Mrs. Mehta stood at the front of the classroom, holding a bright yellow notice in her hands. The students were restless, chattering among themselves, but when she cleared her throat, the room fell silent. She had that effect on people, not because she was strict, but because when she spoke, she always had something worth hearing. The district science fair was coming up in 2 months. Any student could participate by submitting a project proposal. The winners from the district would move on to the state level, and from there, possibly to nationals. Mrs. Mehta's eyes swept across the classroom as she explained the rules. When her gaze landed on Priya, there was a slight nod, almost imperceptible. An encouragement meant only for her. After class, several students crowded around Mrs. Mehta, asking questions about the competition. Most of them were from well-off families. They talked excitedly about getting their parents to buy equipment and materials. One boy, Vikram, whose father owned a pharmacy, was already planning to do something with chemicals. A girl named Ritu wanted to build a robot, and her parents had promised to hire someone to help her. Priya hung back, waiting until everyone had left. Mrs. Mehta looked up from her desk and smiled. She'd been expecting this. "You're going to enter, aren't you?" Mrs. Mehta said. It wasn't really a question. Priya nodded but didn't speak. There was something heavy in her chest, a mix of excitement and fear. "What's holding you back?" Mrs. Mehta asked gently. "I don't know what to make," Priya admitted. "And even if I think of something, how will I buy the materials?" Mrs. Mehta came around the desk and sat on the edge, looking at Priya directly. "The best projects don't come from expensive materials. They come from solving real problems. Think about your neighborhood. Think about the issues you see every day. What needs fixing?" That night, Priya couldn't sleep. She lay on the thin mattress next to her sleeping father, staring at the ceiling. Real problems. What were the real problems in her life? There were many. But which one could she actually do something about? Water. The thought came to her suddenly. Water was always a problem. The tap in their lane ran for only 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening. The water that came through wasn't clean. It had a brownish tint and often smelled strange. People in the neighborhood boiled it before drinking, but not everyone could afford enough fuel to boil all the water they needed. Children got sick frequently. Just last month, 3 families in their lane had been affected by waterborne diseases. What if she could make something that cleaned water? Something simple and cheap that anyone could build? The idea consumed her. She spent every free moment thinking about it. During her lunch break at school, while other students played or ate together, Priya sat under a tree and sketched designs in her notebook. She went to the school library and read everything she could find about water purification, sand filters, charcoal absorption, UV treatment, chemical purification. Each method had advantages and disadvantages. After 2 weeks of research, she settled on a design that combined sand filtration with charcoal absorption. It wouldn't remove everything, but it would get rid of the worst impurities and make the water much safer to drink. The best part was that all the materials were either cheap or free. She could use a large plastic drum, layers of sand and gravel from the riverbed, and charcoal that she could make herself by burning wood in a controlled way. But turning the idea into reality was harder than she'd imagined. She needed access to a space where she could work and experiment. Mrs. Mehta arranged for her to use the school laboratory after hours. The lab assistant, an older man named Ramu, was initially reluctant. Students weren't supposed to be in the lab unsupervised. But Mrs. Mehta convinced him, and more than that, Ramu became curious about what this quiet girl was trying to build. Priya collected materials slowly. She saved every rupee her father gave her for lunch, and instead ate the cheapest food from street vendors, sometimes just a piece of bread with salt. She asked shopkeepers for empty plastic containers. She went to the riverbed early one Sunday morning and filled bags with sand and small stones, carrying them back home on her head like she'd seen women carry water pots. Her arms ached for days afterward. The hardest part was making the charcoal. She needed to burn wood at a high temperature without letting it turn completely to ash. After several failed attempts that left her coughing from smoke and covered in black soot, she finally figured out the right method. Her neighbors thought she was crazy, this girl burning wood in an old paint tin behind their building. But she didn't care what they thought. Building the first prototype took 3 weeks. She worked on it every evening after school and all day on Sundays. Her father watched with concern. He wanted to help, but he didn't understand what she was doing. He just made sure she had tea and something to eat while she worked. The design was simple. Dirty water would be poured into the top of the drum. It would pass through a layer of cloth to catch large particles, then through charcoal to absorb chemicals and bad tastes, then through layers of sand and gravel of different sizes. Clean water would collect at the bottom and could be drawn out through a small tap. When she finally tested it for the first time, her hands were shaking. She poured in the murky water from their neighborhood tap, the kind that usually looked like weak tea. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, drop by drop, water began to come out of the bottom tap, and it was clear. Completely clear. Priya held a glass under the tap and watched it fill. The water looked clean, but would it be safe to drink? She took the sample to the school lab and asked Ramu if they could test it. He looked skeptical but agreed. The basic tests they could do in the school lab all came back good. The water was free from visible contaminants. It had no smell. The pH was neutral. But Priya wanted to be sure. She asked Mrs. Mehta if there was any way to get it tested properly. Mrs. Mehta took the sample to a friend who worked at a government water testing facility. 3 days later, the results came back. The water met basic safety standards. It wasn't perfect, but it was dramatically better than the input water. More importantly, it was better than what most people in poor neighborhoods had access to. Priya had done it. She had created something that actually worked, something that could actually help people. But the real test was still ahead. She had to present this at the district science fair, competing against students who had resources she could only dream of. And she had to do it convincingly enough to win. The day of the district science fair arrived faster than Priya had expected. She'd spent the past week preparing her presentation, writing and rewriting her explanation until Mrs. Mehta said it was perfect. But knowing something was perfect on paper and actually standing in front of judges were two very different things. The fair was being held at a prestigious private school on the other side of the city. When Priya and her father arrived at the gates, they both stopped and stared. The building looked more like a palace than a school. Marble columns, manicured lawns, a fountain in front of the entrance. Students and parents streamed in, most arriving in private cars. Priya looked down at her faded uniform and worn shoes. Her father, sensing her hesitation, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You belong here just as much as anyone else," he said quietly. "More because you've worked harder." They walked in together, Rajesh carrying Priya's water filter prototype, which they'd carefully wrapped in old newspapers for the journey. They'd taken 3 different buses to get here, leaving home at dawn. Rajesh had taken the day off work, which meant losing a day's wages, but he wouldn't have missed this for anything. The science fair was set up in the school's huge auditorium. Tables were arranged in rows, each displaying a project. Priya had been assigned table number 47 near the back. As they made their way there, she couldn't help but notice the other projects. They were impressive, elaborate, professional-looking. One student had built a working solar panel system with digital displays. Another had created a robotic arm that could pick up objects. There were chemistry experiments with colorful liquids in expensive glassware, computer programs running on brand new laptops. Priya's water filter suddenly seemed so simple, so crude. Just a plastic drum with sand and stones inside. What had she been thinking? She set up her display with trembling hands. She'd made charts explaining how the filter worked, drawing each diagram carefully with colored pencils. She'd brought samples of dirty water and clean water in glass bottles to show the difference. She'd written out her research notes in a folder. It was all she had. At the next table, a boy named Arjun was setting up his project about renewable energy. His father, who seemed to be some kind of engineer, was helping him arrange everything. Arjun glanced over at Priya's simple setup and smirked. He whispered something to his father, and they both laughed. Priya felt her face burn with shame. Rajesh noticed. He leaned close to Priya and whispered, "Fancy wrapping paper doesn't make a gift more valuable. What's inside is what matters." The judging began at 10 in the morning. There were 5 judges, all of them professors or scientists from local colleges. They would spend a few minutes at each table asking questions, examining the projects. The students had to explain their work and answer whatever the judges asked. Priya watched nervously as the judges moved from table to table. They spent a long time at the solar panel project. They seemed impressed by the robotic arm. At each table, the students spoke confidently, using big technical words, their parents standing proudly nearby. Finally, the judges reached table 47. There were 3 men and 2 women, all wearing official-looking badges. One of the women, who had gray hair and kind eyes, smiled at Priya. "Tell us about your project," she said. Priya's mind went blank. For a terrible moment, she couldn't remember anything she'd planned to say. The judges waited. She could feel Arjun at the next table watching her, probably enjoying her discomfort. She looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and began. "In my neighborhood, the water that comes from the tap is dirty. Many children get sick because of it. My project is a low-cost water filter that anyone can make using materials that are easy to find. It uses sand, gravel, and charcoal to remove impurities and make the water safe to drink." Her voice was soft at first, but as she continued explaining, it grew stronger. She showed them her diagrams. She demonstrated how water entered from the top and came out clean from the bottom. She explained the science behind each layer, how sand trapped particles, how charcoal absorbed chemicals, how gravel provided support and additional filtration. The judges asked questions. Tough questions. How did she know the water was actually clean? What about bacteria? What about chemicals that might not be removed? Had she tested it? How long would the filter last before the materials needed to be replaced? Priya answered each question. She showed them the water testing results. She admitted the limitations of her design honestly. Yes, it wouldn't remove everything. Yes, it would work best as a pre-filter, followed by boiling, but it would make a significant difference, and it cost less than 200 rupees to build. Compare that to commercial filters that cost thousands. One of the male judges, a stern-looking man with glasses, seemed skeptical. "Did you build this yourself?" he asked. "Or did someone help you?" The implication was clear. He thought she was too young, too poor, too ordinary to have done this on her own. "I built it myself," Priya said firmly. "My teacher, Mrs. Mehta, let me use the school laboratory, and the lab assistant, Ramu sir, helped me access materials. But the design and the work are mine." "Why this project?" the judge pressed. "Why water?" Priya looked at him directly. "Because last month my neighbor's baby died from waterborne disease. He was only 8 months old. His family couldn't afford clean water or a good filter. If they'd had something like this, maybe he would still be alive." The auditorium seemed to go quiet. Even Arjun at the next table had stopped smirking. The kind-looking woman judge wrote something in her notepad. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is excellent work." The judges moved on. Priya slumped into her chair exhausted. Her father squeezed her hand. "You did wonderfully," he said. They had to wait for hours while the judges completed their evaluation. Other students had brought lunch from home or bought food from the school canteen. Priya and Rajesh shared the 2 rotis and potato sabzi they'd brought wrapped in newspaper. They sat on a bench outside the auditorium, watching expensive cars come and go. At 4 in the afternoon, everyone was called back inside for the results. Priya's heart hammered in her chest. She told herself it didn't matter if she won. She'd done her best. She'd learned so much. That was what really counted. But deep down, she wanted to win. She wanted it so badly it hurt. The principal of the host school stood at the podium with a microphone. He began announcing the results, starting with third place, a project about plant growth. Then second place, the solar panel project. Arjun and his father looked disappointed. And the first place winner, who will represent our district at the state-level science fair, the principal paused for effect, is project number 47, Low-Cost Water Purification System by Priya Kumar. For a moment, Priya didn't move. She couldn't believe what she'd heard. Her father had to practically push her out of her seat. Her legs felt like water as she walked to the podium. The principal handed her a certificate and a small trophy. Cameras flashed. People clapped. She looked out at the audience and found her father's face. He was crying openly, not caring who saw. And that made Priya start crying too. She'd won. Against all odds, she'd actually won. The certificate from the district fair was now pinned to the wall of their single room, right above where Priya slept. She looked at it every morning when she woke up and every night before sleeping. State level. She was going to the state-level science fair. The thought filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. The state fair was in the capital city, 300 kilometers away. It would be held in 6 weeks. The school would provide some support, the principal had said, but families were expected to cover most of the costs: transport, accommodation, food. When Mrs. Mehta had privately told Rajesh the estimated expenses, his face had gone pale. It would cost more than 3 months of his salary. That night, Rajesh did something he'd never done before. He went to the moneylender in their neighborhood. The man operated from a small shop, lending money at interest rates that trapped people in debt for years. Rajesh had always avoided him, no matter how desperate things got. But this was different. This was for Priya's future. The moneylender, a man named Shyam, sat behind a wooden desk covered with account books. He looked at Rajesh's worn clothes and calloused hands and smiled in a way that wasn't kind. "How much do you need?" Shyam asked. Rajesh told him. Shyam's smile widened. "That's a lot of money for a watchman." "What's it for?" When Rajesh explained about the science fair, Shyam laughed. "All this for a school competition? What if she doesn't win? How will you repay me?" "She'll win," Rajesh said with quiet certainty. "And I'll repay you regardless. I give you my word, the loan was arranged." The interest rate was crushing, but Rajesh signed the papers without hesitation. When he came home that night, he didn't tell Priya about the moneylender. He just told her not to worry about the expenses. Everything was arranged, but Priya wasn't stupid. She knew they didn't have that kind of money. She knew what her father must have done. That night, lying in the dark, she made a silent promise. She would win. She had to win, not just for herself anymore, but for her father, who had sacrificed everything. The next 6 weeks were a blur of preparation. Priya improved her filter design based on feedback from the district judges. She made her presentation clearer and more professional. She practiced her speech in front of Mrs. Mehta over and over until she could deliver it perfectly. She even borrowed a better school uniform from a classmate who'd outgrown hers, so she'd look presentable at the state level. Word spread in their neighborhood about Priya's achievement. The residents, most of them as poor as Rajesh and Priya, were proud. One of them, an elderly man who ran a tea stall, organized a small collection. He went door to door and people contributed what they could. 10 rupees. 20 rupees. Someone gave 100. In total, they collected nearly 2,000 rupees. It wasn't much compared to what was needed. But when they presented it to Rajesh, he broke down. These were people who had so little themselves, and yet they gave. The day before they were to leave for the state capital, Priya received unexpected news. Mrs. Mehta called her to the staff room. There was someone there to meet her. A woman in a business suit introduced herself as Kavita, a journalist from a local newspaper. She'd heard about Priya's win at the district level and wanted to write a story. Priya was hesitant. She didn't like attention, but Mrs. Mehta encouraged her, saying it might help others learn about her project. So Priya agreed to the interview. Kavita asked about her background, her project, her dreams. She took photographs of Priya with her water filter. She even went to their home and took pictures of their single room, of Rajesh in his Watchman uniform, of the streetlight where Priya studied at night. Priya felt embarrassed about having her poverty displayed like this, but Kavita was kind. She said Priya's story would inspire people. The article was published the morning they left for the state capital. Rajesh bought a copy at the station before they boarded the train. The headline read, "From Streetlight to Spotlight, Watchman's Daughter Heads to State Science Fair." There was a large photo of Priya with her project, and another smaller one of her and Rajesh together. On the train, people recognized them from the newspaper. An elderly couple insisted on sharing their home-cooked food with them. A businessman asked detailed questions about the water filter and said if Priya won at the state level, he might be interested in funding production. A college student asked for Priya's autograph, saying she was an inspiration. Rajesh watched it all with wonder. His daughter, who he'd raised in a single room, who studied under streetlights, was being treated like someone important, someone who mattered. They reached the state capitol late in the evening. Mrs. Mehta had arranged for them to stay at a budget guest house near the fair venue. It was nothing fancy, but to Priya and Rajesh, who usually shared one room, having 2 beds and an attached bathroom felt like luxury. The next morning, they went to the venue early. The state fair was even more impressive than the district one. It was being held at the city's science museum, a huge complex with multiple halls. There were over 100 projects from different districts across the state. The competition would be fierce. As Priya set up her display, she noticed the quality of projects around her was exceptional. These weren't just district winners. These were the best of the best. A girl from the coastal district had developed an early warning system for tsunamis using simple electronic components. A boy from the mountains had created a portable oxygen concentrator for high-altitude areas. Someone had built a drone that could plant trees in difficult terrain. Priya's confidence wavered. Her water filter suddenly seemed basic compared to these innovative projects. These students had clearly put months, maybe years, into their work. They had resources, support, and expertise she could only dream of. She was setting up her charts when she overheard 2 students at a nearby table talking. They were looking at her project with barely concealed disdain. "A water filter? That's so simple," one of them said. "My cousin made something like that in elementary school." "I know, right?" The other replied. "How did this even win at district level? The judges there must have been really lenient." Priya's face burned. She wanted to pack up and leave. What was she doing here, competing with these brilliant students? She was just a watchman's daughter who'd gotten lucky once. But then she remembered why she'd made the filter in the first place. The baby who'd died, the families who got sick, the real people with real problems who needed real solutions. Her project might be simple, but it was practical. It was useful. It was something that could actually change lives. She finished setting up her display, and when the judges arrived, she was ready to show them exactly why her simple water filter mattered more than all the complex gadgets in the room. The state-level judging was different from the district competition. Here there were 8 judges, all of them senior scientists and professors from the state's top universities. They spent longer at each project, asking deeper questions, pushing students to defend their work and explain their thinking. Priya watched as they moved methodically through the hall. At the tsunami warning system, they spent nearly 20 minutes clearly impressed. At the oxygen concentrator, one judge actually made notes in a small book he carried. Even projects that Priya thought were less impressive than hers received serious consideration and lengthy questioning. When the judges finally reached her table, Priya's mouth was dry. Her father stood a little distance away, his watchman's uniform standing out among the well-dressed parents around them. He gave her an encouraging nod. A judge with gray hair and sharp eyes looked at her display. "A water filter," he said, his tone neutral. "Tell me why you chose this project." Priya had prepared for this. She'd practiced her speech dozens of times. But now, standing in front of these distinguished scientists, she decided to speak from her heart instead. "In my neighborhood, 16 families share one water tap. The water runs for only 4 hours a day and it's not clean. Last year, 43 people in our area got sick from waterborne diseases. 3 of them died, including an 8-month-old baby. His name was Muna." She paused. The judges were listening intently now. "I started thinking about why this keeps happening. Commercial water filters cost 3,000 rupees or more. For a family earning 200 rupees a day, that's half a month's income, even if they could afford it. Many don't trust technology they don't understand, so they keep drinking dirty water or spend money on fuel to boil it, which is expensive too." She gestured to her filter. "This costs 180 rupees to build. Every part can be found locally. There's no electricity needed, no complex machinery. Anyone can maintain it. I've tested it on water from my neighborhood, and it removes 90% of visible impurities and most harmful bacteria. It's not perfect, but it's affordable and accessible. One of the female judges leaned forward. You mentioned testing. Walk me through your testing process. Priya did in detail. She explained how she'd collected water samples from different taps in her area, how she'd tested them before and after filtration, how she'd used the school laboratory to check for basic contaminants, how Mrs. Mehta had helped her get professional testing done at a government facility. The sharp-eyed judge asked, "What about scaling this up? If someone wanted to make this available to more communities, what would be the challenges?" This was a question Priya hadn't expected, but she thought quickly. The biggest challenge would be quality control. Each filter needs to be built carefully. The layers of sand and charcoal need to be the right thickness. People would need training, but that's also an opportunity. You could train local people to build and maintain these filters, creating jobs in the community. Another judge chimed in. What about the environmental impact? Where do people dispose of the dirty sand and charcoal when it needs replacing? The materials are completely natural, Priya explained. Used sand and charcoal can be composted or used in gardens. There's no harmful waste. The questioning went on for nearly half an hour, far longer than any other project Priya had seen. When it finally ended, the lead judge smiled at her. This is impressive work. You've thought about not just the science, but the practical implementation. That's rare, especially at your age. After the judges moved on, Priya felt drained but hopeful. She'd answered everything they asked. She'd defended her project well. Now all she could do was wait. The results wouldn't be announced until evening. Priya and her father walked around the fair, looking at other projects. Despite her nervousness, Priya found herself fascinated by the innovations around her. The tsunami warning system used clever arrangements of floating sensors. The oxygen concentrator employed principles she'd never heard of. She made mental notes, thinking about what she could learn from each design. Around lunchtime, something unexpected happened. The journalist, Kavita, who'd interviewed Priya back home, appeared at the venue. She'd driven 300 kilometers to cover the state fair, specifically to follow Priya's story. She interviewed Priya again, asking how she felt about the competition. She spoke to Rajesh about his sacrifices. She even interviewed Mrs. Mehta, who'd come with another student from their school. Other journalists noticed and came over. Suddenly, Priya found herself surrounded by reporters, all asking questions, taking photos. Some participants looked annoyed by the attention Priya was getting, but others were curious and supportive. The girl with the tsunami warning system came over and introduced herself as Lakshmi. She said she'd heard Priya's presentation and thought it was brilliant because it focused on real problems that affected real people. By evening, when the results were to be announced, a small crowd had gathered around Priya and her father. The newspaper article had made her something of a celebrity. People wanted to meet the Watchman's daughter who'd made it this far. The announcement ceremony was formal. The education minister of the state was present to give away the awards. All participants were seated in an auditorium. Parents and teachers filled the back rows. Cameras were set up. It felt more like a major event than a school competition. The minister gave a speech about the importance of science and innovation. Then the head judge took the microphone to announce the results. There would be 3 winners who would go on to represent the state at nationals. 3rd place, 2nd place, 1st place. 3rd place went to the portable oxygen concentrator. The boy who'd made it walked up to enthusiastic applause. 2nd place went to an agricultural project about drought-resistant farming techniques. The girl who'd created it seemed thrilled. Then came 1st place. The head judge cleared his throat. This year's 1st place winner impressed us not just with scientific knowledge, but with practical thinking and social awareness. The project addresses a critical need in a way that's both innovative and accessible. The winner is Priya Kumar for her low-cost water purification system. Priya sat frozen. She'd won. She'd actually won the state-level competition. Her father grabbed her hand and squeezed it tight. Around them, people were clapping, some standing up. Mrs. Mehta was crying happy tears. Priya walked to the stage in a daze. The education minister shook her hand and placed a medal around her neck. He handed her a certificate and a trophy that was bigger than anything she'd ever owned. Cameras flashed. He asked her to say a few words. Priya looked out at the audience. Her father was standing now, his face wet with tears. She saw Mrs. Mehta beaming with pride. She saw the other students who'd competed, some disappointed, others clapping genuinely. "I want to thank my father," Priya said into the microphone, her voice shaking slightly. "He works as a watchman to pay for my education. He gave up everything so I could be here today. This award is his as much as mine." The audience erupted in applause. Several people were wiping their eyes. The education minister looked moved. He announced that the state government would provide full funding for all 3 winners to attend the national competition in New Delhi, including travel, accommodation, and any resources needed to improve their projects. But there was more. The businessman who'd spoken to Priya on the train had kept his word. He approached Rajesh after the ceremony and said his company wanted to fund the development and distribution of Priya's water filters. They would start with a pilot program in 10 villages, providing filters at cost price and training locals to build and maintain them. If successful, they'd scale up across the state. A representative from a prestigious science university offered Priya a guaranteed scholarship for when she finished school. They said they needed students like her, students who combined brilliant minds with social consciousness. That night, back at their guest house, Priya and Rajesh sat together on one of the beds. Between them lay the trophy, the medal, the certificate, and several business cards from people who wanted to support Priya's work. "Papa," Priya said quietly, "I know you borrowed money from Shyam uncle for this trip." Rajesh looked surprised. "How did you know?" "I'm not a child anymore. I understand how things work," Rajesh sighed. "I would borrow 10 times more if needed." "You're worth it, the prize money," Priya said. "It's 50,000 rupees. That can pay back the loan and the interest. That's your money. For your future." "My future is secure now," Priya pointed out. "I have a scholarship. People want to support my project. The businessman said he'll pay for developing the filter design. We should use the prize money to clear the debt." They argued about it for a while, but eventually Rajesh agreed. It felt good to know they wouldn't be trapped in debt. Better still was knowing that Priya's invention would soon help people across the state access clean water. 2 months later, they went to New Delhi for the National Science Fair. The competition was even tougher, with brilliant students from every state. But Priya wasn't intimidated anymore. She'd learned that real innovation wasn't about complex technology or expensive equipment. It was about solving problems that mattered. She didn't win first place at nationals. She came in third, but that was enough to get national media attention. News channels ran stories about the Watchman's daughter, who'd designed a water filter to help her community. The central government's Rural Development Ministry took notice. They invited Priya to present her design to their team. Within a year, a modified version of Priya's filter was being distributed through government programs to villages across 3 states. It was part of a larger clean water initiative, but Priya's design was at the heart of it. Thousands of families now had access to cleaner water because of her invention. Priya went on to study environmental engineering at the country's top technical university on full scholarship. She never forgot where she came from. Every semester break, she returned to her neighborhood, not in shame but in pride, to teach local children about science and to remind them that their circumstances didn't define their potential. Rajesh still worked as a watchman. He could have retired early with the money that came from various awards and recognition Priya received, but he chose to keep working. He said he liked the routine, liked feeling useful. But now, instead of standing guard with worry about his daughter's future, he stood with pride, knowing he'd helped nurture something extraordinary. The water filter itself evolved over time. Engineers and scientists refined Priya's basic design, making it more efficient. But they always credited her as the original inventor. Because innovation, as Priya proved, doesn't require fancy laboratories or expensive equipment. It requires seeing a problem, caring enough to solve it, and having the determination to keep trying even when others doubt you. That's what Priya Kumar did. A girl who studied under streetlights, who grew up in a single room, who was told by some that her dreams were too big. She proved that brilliance isn't determined by wealth or privilege. It's determined by passion, perseverance, and the courage to believe that one person really can make a difference, and sometimes, the daughter of a watchman can change the world. 5 years had passed since Priya won the National Science Award. She was now 20 years old, in her final year of engineering college, The girl who once studied under streetlights was now among the top students at one of the country's most prestigious technical universities. But success hadn't changed her. Every month, without fail, she returned home to visit her father. The single room where they'd lived for so many years was still there, though Rajesh could have afforded something better by now. He said it reminded him of how far they'd come and kept him grounded. On this particular Saturday morning, Priya arrived to find her father preparing tea. He was older now, his hair more gray than black, but he still wore his watchman's uniform with the same dignity he always had. He'd finally agreed to work just the evening shift now, giving his aging body some rest. "Papa, I have news," Priya said. Accepting the cup of tea he handed her, Rajesh sat down, giving her his full attention like he always did. Even when she was explaining complex engineering concepts he didn't fully understand, he listened as if her words were the most important thing in the world. "Remember my water filter project?" Priya asked. Rajesh laughed. "How could I forget? It changed our lives. Well, it's changing more lives now. The government report came out yesterday. Over 500,000 families across 7 states are using the filters. Waterborne disease cases in those areas have dropped by 68%. Rajesh's eyes filled with tears. He did that more easily now, especially when it came to Priya's achievements. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered. "There's more," Priya continued. "An international organization working on clean water solutions wants to take the design to other countries. Villages in Africa and Southeast Asia facing similar problems. They've asked me to join their team after I graduate." She watched her father's face carefully. This would mean traveling abroad, being away for long periods. She wouldn't be able to visit him every month. Rajesh was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, that same warm smile that had encouraged her through every challenge. "You must go," he said simply. "Your work isn't just for our neighborhood anymore. It's for the world. But what about you?" "I'm not alone anymore," Rajesh said. "Mrs. Mehta visits. The neighbors check on me, and you've taught the children in our lane to pursue education. 3 of them got into good colleges this year, because you inspired them. I'm surrounded by the change you created." They sat together in comfortable silence, sipping their tea. Through the open door they could see children in the lane, some of them reading books, others working on school projects. The streetlight where Priya used to study was still there, but now it had been upgraded to a brighter LED light that the community had installed together. "Do you remember what I used to tell you?" Rajesh asked. Priya nodded. "Great things come from small beginnings. Your beginning was small, a single room, a streetlight, a simple water filter, but look at what it became. You proved that circumstances don't define destiny. Hard work and determination do." That evening, as Priya prepared to leave, she hugged her father tightly. He felt frailer than before, but his spirit was as strong as ever. She thought about how he'd sacrificed everything, worked night shifts, borrowed money at crushing interest rates, all so she could chase her dreams. "Thank you, Papa," she said, "for believing in me when I was just a girl with a crazy idea about cleaning water." "You were never just a girl with an idea," Rajesh replied. "You were my daughter, and I always knew you would do something extraordinary." As Priya walked down the lane toward the main road, she turned back one last time. Her father stood at the door, waving. Behind him, the room that had been her entire world once seemed smaller now, but no less important. It was where she'd learned that the size of your dreams matters more than the size of your home. The Watchman's daughter had won awards and recognition. She'd created something that helped hundreds of thousands of people, but her greatest achievement, she realized, was proving that every child, regardless of where they start, deserves a chance to shine. And sometimes all it takes is one person who believes in you completely. For Priya, that person had been her father, a simple watchman who gave his daughter the world.